Welcome everyone to this first installment of a new brainchild on the Bodaka, under the Bodaka banner, and called On the Polis. Lucky here, as we all know, Dave Maro, who's one of the main organizers of Bodaka, and he's kindly allowed us to see if we can pilot this discussion series. And before we get into the first content of what we'll be taking a look at today, I wanted to sort of share a little bit why, how. There's the why. That is always one of the most important things behind any kind of discussion. And the brainchild for this thing, or the root of why I wanted to have this discussion, is something I've been thinking about quite a long time, specifically after coming to America about 2 years ago. And basically what we see in the modern world is that the average citizen everybody is very much pulled into the political arena. Isn't it amazing? Everybody has their political opinion. Everybody is very much aware of what's happening in the political realm. And over many years, after having also studied political philosophy and political science at university, then you just sort of realize that there's sometimes there's some basic ideas that are very helpful before one look at the at the actual state of the world today. So me and David Marova, we had a little bit of a discussion about it, and we both agreed that it could be interesting because he himself also given an opportunity now to reveal all his credentials that qualify him as a political commentator. But we both, having studied a little bit, we thought that it can be useful to not look at politics in the actual sense, and in the terms of, we're not going to look at the actual political situation of the year 2021. We're not going to get too much into specific political rhetoric or polemic or get caught up in the issues of the day.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. Oh, there's enough of that going around. We're going to take a little step back, in one sense, approach it a little more philosophically. See that in general, before one would, even in Plato's time, he had a system that until you're 30 years old, you just study music, mathematics, and gymnastics. And then once you are 30, then you enter into the sphere of political debate, or you enter the sphere of trying to change the world, the external world. So this is, we don't have 20 years, we just have 8 episodes, but we're going to try and give a little crash course on some of the fundamental ideas, philosophical perspectives that we find valuable to understand, or think about, reflect upon, before one even enters into trying to understand the world as it is today. And that is really the business of philosophy, is to take a step back and to first think in a little bit more universal sense. Not just think about 2021, but think about the history of human existence, and to see that there are certain broader patterns that one has to understand. So that's sort of the general gist of it, to understand where we'll be going. We have some episodes outlined. Let's see to what extent we actually follow it. You know how it goes, like you sort of do see where it goes. But we have a general idea of some of the things we want to cover. And so that's my sort of intro that I thought was important before we get our teeth into it, to understand the why, and that will also help everyone understand the how exactly we're going to go about this discussion, and also the how not. Important. Maybe David, you can tell us a little bit what you expect to get out of this series and why you think that it's something that's worthwhile to do.
Sure. Mostly I'm here to get to talk to you because I enjoy that so much. So I was really excited when you invited me on to speak. Also, before I came to Bhakti, I was studying political science at North Carolina State University. So it is an interest of mine. I wanted and felt like the world could be changed through a better understanding of politics. It seemed everyone was concerned with that. And so if I became careful in my ability to consider that, then I could help the most people. And so I've always found it ironic, actually, that after I graduated and I got my degree, etc., my weight, the weight of my opinion wasn't any stronger in conversation about politics. No one cared that I was a political scientist and what that meant. They just had their own opinion. And whatever it was informed by, it mattered more because it was theirs. And I noted that, if you're talking to an engineer about cars, or you're talking to a chemist about paint or something like that, you would give deference to their opinion.
Yeah.
But the political sphere is so personal, and it's so important, seemingly, to people, that they're not willing to give deference to anyone but themselves first. And so I noticed that tendency even in me, and I wanted to sober up, and took my study of philosophy to the point now that here I am practicing Krishna consciousness. So I'm excited to give to those who are interested a little bit more of a circumspect understanding of what it means to discuss politics. As you said, what are the underpinning values? Because then you can have a constructive conversation about the practical things. Before you have those principles in place, though, then your idea of the practicals are just sentiment and often destructive. So I'm excited to get into this with you and whomever else. I know you have a kind of sweet lineup of other potential discussers. So I'm looking forward to both participating but also witnessing the conversation.
Cool. Thanks. That's like the optimism. They achieve our goals. I'm sure many men have tried before and they have failed. So we'll see if we can shed some positive light on this very interesting subject.
Try.
Now, the first episode title for today is called "The Descent of Authority," and basically what I wanted to discuss, and just throw some ideas around this. The reason I think why politics is so, when you're saying why it's so personal for people, is because it has such a direct effect on people's lives. Think about what the government does. You can feel the weight of the government strongly, like either good or bad. Like it's something that very personally affects people. And we see that over the years. I mean, if you would go back 1,000 years in the past, even less, a few hundred years in the past, you see that in general, it's not that not everybody participated so much in the political arena. As our societies become more democratic, the whole basis is that everybody participates, and everybody has to trying to fight to make it better. Now, as my political philosophy professor at college, she said basically the whole question of politics is actually very simple. It's not very complicated. The basic question is very simple. It's just only two questions that's trying to be answered, and that is who gets what, and the second one is says who. Basically, the whole summary of political philosophy, it's not very complicated. Basically means that someone has to decide who gets what, and that doesn't just mean money. It means everything. It means power. It means authority. It means the distribution of responsibility, resources, time, energy, preference of decision, everything. It's all various forms of resource that gets distributed to different people. And so who gets what, and says who? Who's going to decide? Who's going to decide how that cake is sliced up? And it's very simple if you look at it that way. But then that the moment you want to answer that question, it becomes complicated. Now, the first thing I wanted to address, and I think it's the same even in our Krishna consciousness philosophy. Like if you think about the first step in spiritual life is understanding that you're not a body. And then I would say the next most important thing, the most dangerous thing, is there's a few dangerous ideas out there which can sidetrack you in pursuit of the truth. Ideas that look alluringly simple. It looks like this is the alluringly simple answer. And we know what are those ideas when it comes to the question, what is the ultimate goal of life? If you would say, what is the first alluring idea that we are defended against when we start to enter into, for example, the Krishna conscious philosophy? What did you say? What is your thing? What did you say is the first thing that comes to mind?
The first dangerous idea?
Yeah.
Well, that I am God.
Exactly. Seems simple. That seems like a very simple, eloquent solution to the problem.
Yeah.
I'm God, or everything.
I'm God, and I can do whatever I want, and no one can tell me that I can't.
Exactly. And everything is one. As the other one we see, everything is all one. So as you know, it's impersonalism. So basically, trying to deal with the reality of being an individual, which is the challenge of the meaning of life. The problem is that you're an individual. And then you think the solution is to just abandon your individuality. Now, I see that in political rhetoric, that's it's a recurring theme that comes up again and again. People think they can solve the problem of authority by just trying to make it disappear. And that is just the first step in trying to go for a sober understanding of how the world should be organized is to understand that the inevitability of authority. Because if you're going to try to make it disappear, then, but it's not possible, then you're going to make it worse. Yeah.
Mm.
And we see it, I mean, for example, so we don't want to get too particular, but you see, for example, I saw here in the city, you see all these people proposing, some say they're proposing or protesting against police brutality. And then you have a few people in the crowd who say, disband the police.
Mm.
And then you're like, and you look at it and you're like, okay, I mean, I understand, yes, there's definitely police brutality, something has to be done. But just to make the police disappear, like that's just doesn't, it can't, like, if you understand the history of how the police arrived, like basically as a means of protecting civilians who do not have the money to protect themselves, then you understand that the actual, the genesis of the police rise in the fact that it was designed to give protection to people who cannot afford private protection. Therefore, you have a police force that is morally or legally obliged to protect every single individual, even if you don't have money. So, this example of thinking that the simple solution is just disband authority. So anarchy, just pull it down. If the government just disappears, then somehow or other, everyone's problems will be solved. And it must be something you also have encountered over the years. And like, how do you respond when people come with that kind of solution, thinking that it's as simple as that?
Sure. Well, it's much easier to destroy something than to build something and maintain something. And these days, it also passes for activism. Activism is often in destroying and tearing down, but then the positive solution is usually left to someone else. In a modern example, and we'll probably talk a lot about American politics here, just because, for lack of better examples, most of the world is familiar with that. So everybody in our audience will be somewhat familiar with the circumstances. But in Iraq, you had Saddam Hussein, who was not a nice guy, not a very good leader. But by pulling him away, by tearing him down, as the American government did for its own purposes, not necessarily benevolent ones, what was left now is just rule by mafia lords, local regional mafia lords. And the people are more harassed. In general, the Iraqi people are much more harassed than they were when that totalitarian dictator was there. So though by an objective standard, he wasn't a wholesome leader, from the standpoint of nature's arrangement and how things will go, it's better to have a blind uncle than no uncle, because then you have a bunch of people fighting to be the uncle and torturing all of the kids in between. So that's what I've noticed in my own experience. And these ideas of the shirking authority, they're the foundation of America, the American ethic, and therefore the democratic ethic as it's conceived of in the modern world, because America is, to use a pun, trumped up as the best society, is this idea of shedding the influence of a totalitarian monarch, the British, and stepping into our rugged individualism. And we don't need anyone except the authority of our own desire to carry us forth into the best possible existence. And while that has a romantic feel to it, the reality and how it plays out is that same idea is what then is used to subjugate those American people and many others into a very shallow experience of consumerism, where they have no inner sense of value except for what externally they can demonstrate to be better than the Joneses: a bigger car, a bigger house, prettier wife, spouse, whatever. So there's so many issues that are created with that rejection of authority, rather than seeking out wholesome authority. Where can I find an authority who has my best interests in mind? Because there's no question of not having the presence of some authority in my life.
Yeah, and we can see that it's, in one sense, it's more difficult. It's difficult, to find proper authority is a very difficult thing, and therefore, yeah, the first step is to understand that it is unavoidable. Because if you think there's a shortcut, if you think that there's some kind of a shortcut, then you won't want to go to do the hard work, to create or to find proper authority. So,
Yeah.
very interesting, and a nice example that you give it also just practically to see how the destruction of authority very rarely actually leads to a better situation. Ironically enough, I find it interesting I mean, if we were to look at ancient society, then we would see that all ancient societies, they all have their explanation of where the authority comes from. We will take a look in future episodes. We'll take a look at Western ideas. For example, all ideologies, communism, democracy, all so-called modern ideologies, they also have their origin myths. They also have their stories of like where they come from, whether it's the hypothetical social contract or whatever it is. Everybody has their story. So I'd like to give an interesting verse here from the Manu Samhita. So the Manu Samhita, very, very interesting text, naturally also a controversial text in certain instances, depicts an ancient society. It's very different from our modern conception, but at least for us, interested in Vedic tradition, it gives certain principles that are very interesting and that specifically deal with this question of who gets what and says who, and gives us a little glimpse into the ancient world. Now, when we're looking at ancient things, I think it's important, both of us can agree that um, we're not necessarily saying that ancient and how it was done 2000 years ago is how we should do it now. That's also a very interesting thing that we see, and this is, I think, an important point in the Vedic tradition, that in one sense, we see in the Vedas we have this conception of the four different ages, the different yugas.
Mm.
And there we see that actually government does change over the different yugas. Like there is different stages of development of society in the different yugas. So it means that it's not like you cannot really say that's the perfect condition. No,
One
because
size fits all.
exactly, it's like
Yeah.
in the Satya Yuga, then we see that in general, because people were much more pious. For those we know, the golden age, there's the four ages in the Vedic conception and in the beginning of the creation. And these ages are changing just like the seasons. So it's not like in the beginning, at the end. No, it's just always revolving. We go from the golden age to the silver to the
Cyclical.
exactly cyclical conception of time. And what would really changes is the level of human consciousness. It oscillates. So in the beginning, in the golden age, this we also find in Plato. Many traditions have this idea. Plato speaks about it in the Republic also, the different ages. And in the beginning ages was the golden age. At that point, people were mostly actually just practicing meditation, spiritual life. There was no civilization, no real society, because it wasn't required. Because there was just nature itself was responding to the piety of human people. So therefore, it is explained how it would rain every night and the sun would shine every day. So it was just things were just growing. It's very similar to the conception of the Garden of Eden that we also see in the Bible. So this idea that in the primordial time, people didn't have to work, and at that time also nature just supplied abundantly, and people lived without any conflict because no one was interested in. There was nothing to fight about. So then in the next age, then we see that generally, then gradually human society becomes more involved in the world, and they start to collect in groups. They start to live together. So instead of everybody just living in a kind of, in one sense, it was anarchic. There was no government because no government was required. But then when they started to live together, conditions became harsher because people became more involved, and that's when we get the age of kings, the age of civilizations. And it's at that point that Varnashram actually manifested the idea that there's different castes of society because now immediately people have to be separated according to their labor. And then in the next stage that develops more, and in the Kali Yuga, we see the disintegration, where what happens is that in the modern age, it characterized by unqualified people that actually take the powers of political power, and then great havoc ensues. So I find that very interesting that even for us, because we're looking at an ancient tradition, but you cannot simply say that this is how things should be. This is like we should just go for a monarchy. Like realistically, it doesn't. I think it's very very difficult to think that we can really go again for a monarchy as it existed 100 years ago. What to speak of as it existed 2,000 years ago. So what do you think about how do you approach, for example, something like politics? Like how do you see looking at the ancient? What do we get from looking at an ancient tradition and actually trying to answer contemporary issues when it's not so simple to just put it on and say we should just do it like this.
Well, it definitely depends on which ancient tradition we're looking at. At the same time, what you see in any ancient tradition is principle first and practicals second or particulars second. And in our modern dialogue, it's exactly the opposite. There's no discussion of principle. There's just a kind of ad hoc assumption about what the word or the concept means, and then this poking at the particulars of it, the other side. And what you were discussing about the idea of different social administrations being valuable at different times and even for different groups of people, that resonates a lot because I remember when I was first being introduced to Krishna conscious philosophy, I was very attracted to this idea of the Varnashram system. And today, commonly, it's understood as the caste system, this very abusive, unhealthy social dynamic in India. And you and I have both been to India many times.
Yeah.
We've seen how oppressive the caste system is. But the archetype that's there in the philosophy and was fleshed out in a healthier way in previous ages actually facilitates people to express themselves in a very natural, happy way. And I could recognize that because I remember the same kind of categorization being done to me when I entered into my freshman year of college. As a freshman, they had us all take this survey course because they want you to graduate in 4 years so that their numbers go well and that they get ranked as a better university. And so they want you to figure out your major right away. And so they put us all through this personality indicator test called the MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is based on Carl Jung's work. And in there, it breaks you down, and there's 16 or so dynamics to the breakdown, but then there's a core 4 breakdowns, a core 4 types of people that you will be filed under. And most people are going to be filed under what's called a guardian, somebody who is very happy being told what to do. And if they're told what to do in the right context, can be very capable within a certain sphere, right? Essentially a worker, somebody who's a skilled laborer. They may be a skilled laborer as an architect. They may be a skilled laborer as an accountant, not necessarily just like a plumber or an electrician, but some kind of skilled labor where they're not making big decisions strategically, but more on a technical level. Most people are comfortable in that kind of experience. And then very rarely you'll get what they called in this system a counselor, which is someone who can see very big picture, consider the needs, interests, and concerns of everyone naturally, not after they take workshops about it and read books and be told that that's how you should think and how you should treat others, but just from the core of their heart, that's how they think. There might be 0.1% that's going to end up in that sphere. And then the other 2 sections, they also have much narrower percentages than those guardian groups. And that's exactly how the Vedic paradigm shakes out society, that most people are going to fall into the category of what's called Shudras, those people who are happy being under the guidance of benevolent rulership, where then they can just focus on their particular immediate concerns, their trade, their craft, and their family. And a very few people belong thinking about big picture things. Now, if we look at today and the anxiety, the fear, the frustration, the stress that people are feeling, one of the easy ways to point to why that is because you have a lot of people thinking about things they're not supposed to think about.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to think what trade agreement should America have with Russia or China. That's way above the pay grade of almost all of us. Even if we are of that Brahminical, thinking nature, even if you do have that capacity to think that way, should you really be spending your time? Do you have any influence within that realm? The answer is almost certainly no, especially when you consider that our political system was founded on the principle, and this is maybe something we'll get into in later discussions. The founders basically constructed the Republic of America, which the rest of the world's democracies are based around now, with the idea that the everyday person cannot understand the larger influences in their society. And because they can't understand them, because their day-to-day is so filled up with grinding the grain and taking 3 hours to wash the clothes on a washboard and taking 4 hours to bake the bread after you grind the wheat, your day was so worked or enwrapped by just maintaining yourself. And there's no Google and there's no New York Times. You can't keep track of everything that's going on. So now, fast forward again 300 years, we have so much information coming to us about what's going on in society, and yet we have almost no facility to influence it. And then even if we did, do we really belong thinking about those things? Is that the specialization that I belong experiencing, or should I be more concerned with some other realm and be able to trust another member of my society to be able to consider those things? And that's what you see wisdom cultures breaking themselves off into, is those specialized groups, the tradesmen, the the businessmen, the administrators, and then the highest, the priests, those who have a spiritual vision. And this is there in the fundaments of our Western political psychology also. Plato, in his Republic, speaks about Socrates extolling philosopher kings, kings who were more philosophically minded, more spiritually minded, big picture than they were every day. And that's the ideal monarch, somebody who's really concerned with the best interest of others. And that's not at all what we see fleshing out today.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I like the point about, in one sense, a large form of anxiety is because people are focusing on things that are not within their circle of influence. Like the circle of concern is just way too broad. And even the other reality also is that the reality is many societies now become so complicated, no one really knows, actually. No one, like, there's many questions we can see, for example, I read an article on the future of crypto, and no one knows really. This
Yeah, right.
unleashed, it's so complicated, and
Out in the dark.
it connects in with a whole complicated economical system, and it's just no one really, it's just they've created something that is very complicated and that many people don't actually understand, and no one really, and you can guess and sort of estimate. So that's a very interesting point, and that's why I also like this idea of this discussion, because we're not gonna, the idea is not that we're gonna allow people to necessarily, assess world trade agreements, or but just at least understand, like you're saying, the basic principle, specifically when it comes to personality typing, because that I think is an important part. And I want to share something here quickly. Let's see if this works. Application. Okay. Okay, does that work? Okay.
Nice.
Okay, that's cool. That's not the right sloka though. Okay. So here we go. This is a really nice song. So Manu Sanghita explaining where does the king come from. So at the time when the people were without a king and were utterly perturbed through fear, the Lord created a king for the protection of all. It's very fascinating, this idea that, and that I think is very important for those who are, for those of us who are theistic, that God, it is important to understand that the world is created, like the world has a certain, you say, there's a certain design to it.
Attention.
Exactly, there is a certain intention, and the principle of authority, of divinity and authority, is naturally very much connected, because that is, in one sense, the ultimate answer to the question: says who? Is, well, there's some divine law that regulates who is in control. Now, what's very interesting is that we know that.
Uh-oh.
We know that. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, but we can't see your handsome face, so please come back. Maybe we lost Hari. Bhishmaji, maybe just bring me back into the screen. We can close the shloka out. I'm not sure if you can do that or not. Well, I think where Hari was bringing this was this idea that there's a series of best practices, so to speak, within the creation and this material energy. There's a way for switch.
So, geez, man, it's very difficult to not. If you do it on your phone, the problem is people call you the whole time. Okay. Yes. So, okay, here we have. So very interesting, this idea that then authority has a purpose according to the divine plan, and the purpose of that is protection. And I think that is, one sense, the guiding. If we want to sum up the principle of what we get, the basic principle that has to be understood tonight, the basic thing that we're going to have is, one thing is, authority is not avoidable. It's part of the design of the world. There will be some kind of hierarchy and authority, but there's two ways in which this thing can pan out. Either that authority is ultimately meant to protect people. That is the reason why it is designed like this, is that people are offered protection by authority, by the king. But also we know that if there is, it can be that people can also get reaction. So for those who are exploiting, the result of exploitation is that one will end up potentially under bad authority. So to understand that to have good authority is not inevitable, and it is something, actually, a great privilege. And one could say, just like some people are born with health or born with whatever, so many good privileges come, but one of the most ultimate privileges is to have good authority, whether it starts with your parents or with your society, whatever it is. And it is a very important thing to know that it's a good thing if it is good. And I think many times in the modern world we've lost faith even in the idea of good authority, or like we've forgotten that, yes, okay, there's many examples of people who exploit and who don't. But if you've ever seen good leaders, my God, like a good leader there's nothing that can compare with good authority. If authority is in the hands of the right people. Now, and here I find every other nice sloka is very interesting. What would happen if there is no authority? Here we see, if the king did not untiringly mete out punishment to those that deserve punishment, the stronger would have roasted the weaker like fish on the spit. What a poetic image, my gosh. And that principle is that we see that that is what the protection is for. It's ultimately to protect people from one another. That is the difficult thing. We see that in this world, you have to protect you from the foreign influence, but just from one another. And that's the basic principle of why authority exists. Now, the next step, obviously, in understanding is, see a little bit, look at my notes. Okay, that's one other thing to understand, at least from a Vedic perspective, is that your government, or the condition of the government, is they're not the ultimate authority. They are forced unto the people as a result of what kind of consciousness the people have cultivated. So what we see is that generally the government becomes stronger and stronger and have more control of people, because people's desire become more and more difficult to manage. And that's what we see. When people are simpler, when life is simpler, and when people's desires are simpler, you need much less government. Now people, for example, they call for less government, but you can't, because if a government is in the reaction, it's becoming more and more strong and more invasive, because it's more and more difficult to keep people from freaking exploiting one another like anything. But then the irony is, at the same time, then the government becomes the risk. As the government mechanism becomes so strong, then that is the mechanism. And that's what we see in Kali Yuga. One of the signs is that the government will ultimately just become like robbers. They will be the ones, through taxation, to just completely strip people of all their wealth and their vitality. And that's what we see in many places now when civil order goes down. That's what you see. You just see some kind of a government leader, big mansion, and everybody else is in total poverty. And that is sort of what happens if the wrong people take control. But at least we see, from a very perspective, is that the solution to the problem, it cannot be around, is good authority. To have somehow good leaders. And even if you think about Prabhupada, he said that is the purpose of this whole movement. People tell us, what are you doing? How are you contributing to save the world, make the world a better place? Prabhupada says, listen, we are trying to create people that have the ability to take responsibility without exploiting you. And you see that is such a fascinating part. Even one of the slokas, they said, the Vedic authority can only be wielded by a person who has had the Vedic training. And that, I think, is also a very fascinating thing, that we train for so many things. Like you were using the example of, in the modern world, most people are actually skilled laborers, because our society is so difficult society needs so much intelligence. So whether you are electrician, plumbing, IT, engineering, it's basically doing the same thing. Your intelligence is used to maintain the system, to keep the system going. And that's what most training and education is now meant for. But then we know that in actual fact, in the ancient societies, people were trained for power. They were trained so that one day when you take a position of responsibility, you have the skill and the ability to not misuse that power. And I was wondering just for you, because you're also someone who actually do take responsibility. You're also a responsible leader in a spiritual institution. And, both of us, we sort of, it's not that we went to a gurukul, whatever, somewhere you were thrown into a position of leadership and you had to somehow deal with that. And I was just wondering if some of your own experiences in trying to also be a leader and understand how what that as a skill, the idea of leadership as a skill, and not using it in the right way to actually protect people.
That's an amazing question. I appreciate you asking and giving me that credit, even though I don't know if I would extend the same to myself or if those that I'm responsible for would agree. But I, in my own experience, what I'm able to do well as a leader comes from my sense of purpose, which is higher and beyond my own happiness. When I'm thinking about my own comfort, I'm a terrible leader, and I make compromises in other people's lives that support my own immediate, you know, gratification. But Krishna gave me the opportunity to sweat some of those things out before meeting his devotional community. Before I started practicing bhakti, I worked with this organization for 6 years that basically sold educational textbooks door to door, and they taught you as a college student how to run your own business, how to buy the books, how to sell them to other people at a higher price. And you worked a 12-hour day, but you weren't an employee. You just kind of gave yourself to that schedule, because if you worked 12 hours a day, you were probably going to end up with a nice paycheck at the end of the summer from your commissions, from your sales. So it wasn't a guaranteed salary, but if you stuck to a certain schedule, then you would receive that. And then the real money was made when you learned how to recruit others to do that, and then teach them those same principles of self-control and facing rejection and being responsible in running a business, following through with customers. It was an involved experience. And in learning how to take care of people in a wholesome way there, so that they can get what they want and I can get what I want. And to recognize that's not actually mutually exclusive. What's in my best interest isn't opposed to what's in their best interest. If we actually both take the step towards the higher principle, we're both happier and feel safer. I learned that there in a relative way, you could say, so that when I came into the Krishna consciousness movement, I saw how that principle was playing out on a universal scale. That the king carrying himself in the best way, the ruler, is necessarily good for the citizenry, and vice versa. And so there's a natural harmony in the sense of purpose, happiness, and satisfaction. And when they're seen as mutually exclusive, right? The king is enjoying fat on the lamb, and the subjects are just destitute and impoverished and subjugated, and the king just laughs on his throne with his shiny crown. You know, that's what we see in the movies.
Yeah.
And we don't ever consider that there's an alternative. And as you said, we don't even consider that in our lives, although as rare as it might be in this modern circumstance, we have had powerful leadership in our life. And if we ask ourselves, could that person be my mayor, my governor, my president? Imagine one of them could get up to that position. I might be okay with it. I might be okay with that person being my king if they were given that opportunity, because my sense of trust in them is so powerful. But we don't really allow ourselves to consider that possibility because of this trope of the abusive monarch, the abusive ruler. And it's not only a trope, it's certainly something we've all experienced, that in general, people in positions of power.
Oops. Okay, we lost you there for a second.
Am I back?
You're back. Welcome.
Okay. Hare Krishna. That's the technology's way of stopping me from rambling.
That's it. You got to be careful. Technology gets you. It's because you're so basically, good point. The trope of bad leadership, and how we've all been affected by that, and sort of thinking it as an inevitability. And so you basically you say that you learned a lot of your lessons before taking a position of leadership in Krishna consciousness. You basically learn it in the hard knocks of.
I got to see how it played out. One of the things that attracts me to Krishna consciousness, political social theory included, what to speak of on the spiritual level, is that it does have so many universal applications. And the structure for the way that Krishna advocates society should be run is the way that most good places run. Whether it's a company, a country, or a community, it's the way that things work is that you find what people are good at and you allow them to do that for the higher purpose
Mm,
of the good of that group instead of for their own purpose of self-aggrandizement.
mm.
But in America, that the lower hanging fruit, the easier thing to push people for is their own self-aggrandizement. Because as you pointed out, in education of those higher principles, it takes decades to
Yeah.
really knead that into the fabric of a person's consciousness. Whereas to just get them to do something impulsively based on what's sensually exciting, well, that's not hard. You just put it on the television screen or the cell phone screen and 1,000 times a day. And suddenly you've got literally a button you can push to manipulate somebody to do something. So that expedient leadership is much more tempting for people. And if I could just share one kind of, I think it's an important philosophical underpinning that's come into our Western psychology around politics from some philosophers of yore a couple of hundred years ago. Hobbes, he talked about Leviathan. That was his word for, society and the governance of it. And he was of this pessimistic view that essentially left to our own devices, we're going to kill each other. It's going to be a Lord of the Flies situation. And we won't have our best interests at heart and we'll be roasting each other on the spit. And so he said it's necessary to accept governance. You have to. However, you should accept governance with a social contract. So he rejected this idea that governance is coming from God. He said, left to our own devices, we're just heathens and there's no God to take care of us. He was a bit atheistic. But he recognized this idea that having a social contract is essential, a terms of agreement, so to speak, between you and your ruler. And that's, I think, what's missing in today's society, that it's running on this assumption of authority. You have to have authority, but we've forgotten that authority needs qualification.
Mm.
That authority has to have some benchmarks and standards that it's meeting, not just that we have a president, because we've always had a president for the last 240 years. But exactly what is that person supposed to be doing? And so the Shastra, the spiritual scripture, which addresses some of these social issues that you're showing us, it starts from there. What is the qualification of such a person? What can be expected of them? Then they can meet out some expectations to us, those who are going to be ruled. But first, expectations have to be put and laid out for the ruler. What are the responsibilities that should be in their court? And then they can ask something of us.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can pull up. I have a nice quote here because we try to keep it scriptural. Let's see if this works. So this is another nice quote, because what I found very fascinating when researching leadership, specifically, actually looking at what Scripture says, then you see there's so many times the king is seen as divine. Many times, place it said the king is divine, and we like freak out, like any proper Westerner worth his sweat, like our ancestors, we like the divine king, like burn him, like.
Yeah.
Because of that principle. So that was misused, this philosophy of the idea that the king is divine. But what I found very fascinating is in the same text that we see that the king was explained to be divine, like in the Manusangita, for example. Then you see in that same text, the king is exhorted to say that how he can be destroyed if he misuses his power. Very fun. Let's see if I can pull this quote up quickly. Okay, I think it's coming. Okay. Let me see anything. Can you see it?
We can see something, but it's
more than we should. Okay.
Yeah. It's an intimate look into your online life.
Ish. Let's see. Let's try again.
Maybe just read it to us.
I can post it in the comments. Okay.
Oh yeah, good idea.
So let's see here. Okay, post a comment. So I can post it.
Can you read it to me?
Yes, I can read it to you. Let's see, and I'll put it on the show. Let's see if that works.
Nice.
Okay. Though his mind be already disciplined, he shall always learn discipline from them. The king with a disciplined mind never perishes. And then, so basically exhorting the reality that, listen, yes, the king is divine, but to occupy that position as king, to occupy that divine position, you as a person, you have to be qualified. And that's what I think what missing in the ancient world is understanding, it's not just because you are a king that now you are divine. No, it's like the position of being a king is divine. And you have to have divine qualities if you want to actually obtain it. And here we see, this is another than the second verse in that same section. Let's see if I can put that up there. Okay. Many kings, along with their belongings, have perished through want of discipline, while on account of discipline, many, even though living in forest, have obtained kingdoms. And that's obviously referring to the Pandavas. So the idea is that even though they had nothing, because they had virtue, they actually attained the position of kingship. So that's something interesting for us to understand, is that the exhortation of authority as something divine doesn't mean that anybody who is in a position of authority is necessarily correct. And that's why I think we have this, yes, naturally people have to be checked, and I think that's good. That's definitely a good part of the modern world, is that now if you want to occupy a position of authority, people will check to see, are you legitimate, which I think is good, because I think people have been duped, whether it's however historically we go, but now we see people a little bit more suspicious of authority, and that also has its plus points. But to understand that there is still the ability for people to occupy that position properly if they have received proper. Just like there's so many things that are very difficult to do, but people can do it. There's nuclear scientists, there's like all kinds of people. There's astronauts. It's not everybody can be an astronaut, but with the proper training, you can actually do it. And that's a certain kind of positivity that we just have to regain. We're so jaded modern in the it is so positive to think, hey, listen, it is possible. We can. People can be trained up by experience. And people can actually become qualified. Now, at a certain point in the future, I would really also like to look at this, the reality, the question of, should a leader be perfect? Another misconception, specifically in our society, where we have this idea that, well, if you want to be in a position of power, you have to be basically completely pure and completely perfect. And that's also nonsense, because that we'll take a look at to see that that's not really the qualification for occupying a position of authority. It doesn't mean you're perfect, because even Prabhupada is very interesting. Even some of his spiritual leaders had difficulties. He was surprisingly accommodating. Like if they had a difficulty, he was willing to work with it. We'll also take a look at that, how in spiritual culture, the idea that mercy goes also from the bottom up. And I want to take a look at a certain episode, how even the king asked for mercy from his citizens. Basically, please forgive my minor infractions, and let us work together to basically create a divine harmony.
And it's interesting because that allowance can only be present when there's an adjustment of values in the society. Because at present, everybody wants to be the king so that they can exploit. Right?
Exactly.
I want the position of advantage and influence. But when you're actually in the position of power, as any of us who've ever had any responsibility know, it's not very enjoyable.
No,
it's not very romantic. It's not very exciting. And the citizenry in a healthy society knows that. I don't want to be the king. That job's way harder than putting the horseshoes on the horses or making the barrels or fixing the computers. To be the guy in charge, 1,000 people pointing their fingers at you every day. Please never, you pray to God that you never be put in such a focus of scrutiny. So when that recognition of the responsibility of the position is present, then there's much less tendency to want to usurp the king, and much more of an appreciation for what they're doing. And that accommodating, merciful vision of the citizenry is then possible.
Nice. Yeah. So I remember once I gave a class, or I was in a class that someone gave him, and it was to a group of newer people who wasn't so familiar with Krishna consciousness, and we were speaking about the different levels of consciousness, and how there's some I think it's some astrological texts that explain how there's the ghostly beings, and then the rakshasas, and then the demigod, and this idea that there's this gradual development of consciousness, different levels in which consciousness can manifest.
Mm.
Then one person was like got very upset in the audience. They would get very upset and jittery, and they said, "What?" They put her hand up, and it was a foreign exchange student from I think from Turkey or somewhere, but also highly academic. You can hear from it. It's probably a PhD student or something, someone highly educated. And then she just said, "Is this a hierarchy? Is this a hierarchy?"
Yeah.
Almost like ready to phone the police. Like, there's someone here.
Can't be serious right now.
Someone is saying that the world is hierarchical. Like,
Yeah.
and she was very upset. It's like, is this a hierarchy? Are you saying that there's a hierarchy?
Mm.
Very interesting, this idea that somehow, again, also the hierarchy is inevitably powerful. But now what I found very fascinating, I want to show, let's see if I can pop one other verse on there. Sorry, I like verses because I think it's useful. Now, this is a very interesting verse from the third canto of the Bhagavatam.
Mm.
And this is actually spoken by, this is at the end, for those who are familiar with the Bhagavatam, where the four Kumaras, they cursed the giant Vijay. So the two gatekeepers of the spiritual world were cursed by these sages. And there's a certain point, and there's this like an altercation that happens. And then God himself, Lord Narayan, he comes there to see what is happening. And then he speaks to these sages who are visibly very agitated, very angry about what has happened. In one sense, which is what? Which was what they can say, illegitimate use of force, or like or incapable people in a position of authority. And then basically God, Lord Narayan speaks to sort of appease the situation, right? This is one amazing verse that I think it's probably one of the most profound things that one can find in the Bhagavatam. Let's see if I can pop it out there. Okay. So listen to this. This is God himself speaking. He says, "Because I am the servitor of my devotees, my lotus feet have become so sacred that they immediately wipe out all sin, and I have acquired such a disposition that the goddess of fortune does not leave me, even though I have no attachment for her, and other praise her beauty and observe sacred vows to secure from her even a slight flavor." Now, this interesting understanding that this is God himself who basically positions himself in the hierarchy as the servant of the devotees.
Mm.
He says, "I am the master of my unobstructed internal energy, and the water of the Ganges is the remnant left after my feet are washed. That water sanctifies the three worlds, along with Lord Shiva, who bears it on his head. If I can take the dust of the feet of the Vaishnava on my head, who will refuse to do the same?"
Mm.
This like such a fascinating insight into what one can call, in one sense, an enlightened hierarchy. To understand that there's a material hierarchy which is naturally exploitative, but really divine, real spiritual leadership, or really a divinely ordained system. It's something that it has to be connected with God, and in one sense, it is a manifestation of spiritual reality into the material world. That's when you really get good. There is no way to have good government without. Then you will just have one people being roasted on the spit, just like fish, and it will just take different forms. But here we see that is the core insight. We see that God's understanding of that hierarchy, that vision, is that the principle of the hierarchy is actually one of service. And even God himself, he like positions himself at the bottom. He himself is just the servant of those who are serving him. And it is that sort of, one can say, that's how the paradox is reconciled. Of how power is utilized. And even I think in spiritual communities, like I think for this discussion, I'm not so concerned with the world. I think the world is very big. It's a very big task for us to think that we're going to fix the world, create some system of world organization. Prabhupada also, Srila Prabhupada, when they asked him about it, he would say, no, it is by people becoming purified and life will become simpler, and then naturally government will take a more holistic form, because it's not really something that one can artificially control. It is just a manifestation of the human condition. But for us, I think it's important because we, in one sense, are trying to create a spiritual society. And I think our social development is something that is actually something we can work on. Like, you have a project that you're working on, and I'm also in a specific project, and I'm trying to understand what really is God's vision for how authority and power is supposed to work. And but to see this insight, I think, is at the core of it, to understand that there is something like an enlightened hierarchy where those who are, in one sense, in the top, in terms of the people who have the influence and the power and can make decisions, but that their actual mentality is that they are at the bottom, that they are just concerned with the benefit of other individuals, and that the same thing has to come from the people who are uh, beneath, meaning those who are under the influence of other people's decisions, who are living within the realm shaped by other people. That's just the reality. That's how life works. Like, even if you get a job, there's a boss who decides things that influence you, and that's just how life is. You will always be embedded in some kind of structure where someone else will influence the environment in which you are living in. And that, I think, that also, for those of us who are influenced by others, to have that proper orientation, to understand that in one sense, it is not just one one should it is we have to participate together.
Yes.
We are trying together to create some kind of divine harmony that will then attract the mercy of God, and we all play our role, whether it is as a servant or as a leader. And it is this divine.
Urge now in the modern context, servant leader. If
Exactly.
you're a leader, it's very trendy to call yourself a servant leader. So at least on face value, that recognition is there.
Is there, yeah, but what that really means, that we know, that is very difficult to understand without really understanding spiritual culture properly.
Mm.
And so, with that understanding, I think we can go forward in the future of our discussions. And so, understanding firstly that authority is not bad; it is part of the design system of God. In its highest form, it is a reflection of a spiritual principle in which the ultimate person in control is also ultimately benevolent. And that, for us, the question in trying to create a proper balance in society is, in one sense, trying to emulate that, to see how close we can get to that harmonious relationship between those in power and those who are living in the shelter of those who have power. And that, as we then go from this perspective, we can look at certain other political mechanisms and ideas that are there to help promote this harmony. And I think that's sort of a good first step, to see that you cannot just solve the problem by killing, just blow up the government and think that's going to solve the problem, or disband it, because it will just come back again in a worse. So let us try and do that hard work, not of reformation in one sense, and that it starts ultimately with us. And that's where I find this this sloka so nice, saying how it starts with the king who has to control his senses, meaning that the first victory is ultimately that internal victory. And when you discuss things about leadership, then you might think, how is it relevant? I'm not a king, I'm not a boss. The reality is that all of us, at a certain point, everybody is in some hierarchy at the top. Yeah, like for the most basic level, when you get married, you have children. Then again, you have these people that are completely under your mercy. They're completely open to your influence, open to your control. It is just astounding how much influence you have. So all of us, we're actually just oscillating, cycling.
That's a great microcosm to help people see the value of authority also, right? That when parents neglect their authority in their children's lives and just let the kids do what they want, then that's actually abuse of the children. It's not taking responsibility for the role that you've been divinely given to use that potential for power for the upliftment of those who are your dependents.
Exactly. Yeah. So keeping that in mind, that this discussion is also relevant for everyone, and to understand the principles of leadership, it's all of us have to, at a certain point, lead something, even if you just have to lead yourself, which is
Well,
already difficult. Okay. So any concluding words, Marava? Any before
yeah,
we?
you were reminding me of two great figures of Western society with that last sharing, which I really appreciate. That bringing it home that the lessons here are for all of us in that sense of potential for leadership and responsibility. But the Shakespeare of hippiedom, and hippies were famous for rejecting authority, right? The modern rejection of authority and you stick it to the man, that vibe comes from the hippie era of America. But Bob Dylan, he wrote a very famous song, and he said, "You got to serve somebody." I brought it up here on Google. The opening line: "You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble. You may like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody." So recognizing that and embracing that. And even you brought out that beautiful quote from the Bhagavatam, the Lord himself is eager to serve. He's looking forward to and seeing it as an opportunity, not as some burden or something to usurp later on, but that it's a privilege to serve. And then I was in your framing out of how we can be thinking about these things in a healthy way. I was thinking of one of Hobbes' kind of predecessors, or I'm sorry, proteges later on, John Locke, a famous political philosopher who shaped a lot of what the founding fathers of America thought. And he laid out a kind of apologist track for Hobbes' thinking, because Hobbes basically rejected theism, and that wasn't kosher to do back then. And we don't like it today either, but it especially wasn't kosher back then. And so John Locke talked about natural law and natural rights as compared to divine law and divine rights, recognizing that religious institutions had for a long time abused this idea of divine law as being able to give them carte blanche for doing whatever they wanted in society and accruing lots of wealth at the expense of the general citizenry. So he said, yes, divine law is divine for those that the law speaks to directly. So the Bible, which was the only scripture anyone had in mind, that can be used as a blanket statement for all the people it's speaking to, particularly the Jews. But everyone else has to be under natural law. But then when you look at his natural law, it's very much what's there in our Shastra. It's very much common sense intuition about responsible behavior of a person. And so Locke said, look at natural law and natural rights. And when you look at natural law, you'll find the best way to behave. You'll find the best way to carry yourself, because it's naturally good for you and others. But when the focus on natural rights comes in too heavy, basically what can I get from others, then the tendency is towards hedonism, which is kind of the modern ethic. Everyone's concerned, what are my rights? What are my rights? What are my rights? We don't see any protests demanding responsibility. Give me some responsibility. Give me a way to care for others. We see everybody expecting someone else to do that, passing the buck for that. And so if we bring it back to that self-examination, what can I do personally to take responsibility for those who I have influence over in a healthy way? Then we'll do the best for ourselves and we'll do the best for them.
Nice. Thank you very much, David Madhava, for this discussion. It's definitely been stimulating, and I look forward to see where we're going to take it in the future. So coming up in the future, what will we take a look at? We're going to take a little look in the next episode at, let's see here, the principle of democracy. I think that is one of those philosophical ideas that is very worthwhile looking at. The origin of it, where it comes from, what it really means, and then also reflections on its efficacy, and also just the reality of how democracy is not necessarily, I would say, the panacea for all problems, solve all problems, and even just look at different arguments that people have, potential issues that are there. Because I think when it comes to democracy, as we'll look next week, it definitely at the moment it works. It's the best system we have that works. But to think is a little more critically of it, because a lot of the political rhetoric takes place within the framework that is set by democracy. So
totally.
Step back and look at the bigger picture.
And the unhealthy assumptions baked in there.
Exactly. So they can do that without upsetting anyone next to them. Okay. Thank you very much, David Madhava, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Harivilasa Prabhu. This has been a blast. Thank you for this wonderful discussion.
I look forward to see all of you again with us next week, and please tell your friends. Okay.
Haribo.
Much.